Well, good morning. Welcome to the second annual Space, Cancer, and Personalized Medicine Conference held on the VCOM College of Medicine. My name is Dr. Timothy Yeatman. I'm the Cancer Center Director of the Gibbs Cancer Center Research Institute and the President of the Gibbs Health Institute here in Spartanburg, South Carolina. I'm also the Chief Scientist at CASIS. A little background for you, the Gibbs Cancer Center is a National Cancer Institute designated community cancer center program. We've recruited some of the best doctors and nurses in the world to focus only on cancer and personalized medicine using space-age technologies. You can learn more about us on our new website, which is being launched today. The new web address is gibbscancercenter.org, all one word. I'd also like to acknowledge three visionaries who have been highly supportive of our mission: Bruce Holstein, the CEO of Spartanburg Regional Health System, as well as Marcia and Jimmy Gibbs, our benefactors. Today's conference is principally sponsored by the Center for Advancement of Science and Space, also known as CASIS, and the Gibbs Health Institute, and will focus on personalized medicine both on Earth and in space. The conference is being broadcast live on the CASIS website today through YouTube. Let me tell you a little bit more about our two major sponsors. CASIS was established by Congress to oversee the administration of science on the International Space Station, which was designated as a national laboratory for research. The Gibbs Health Institute, our other sponsor, principal sponsor, was recently established as a novel nationwide initiative in personalized medicine that will revolutionize the drug development process and democratize the clinical trial process. We are building a nationwide trial network that will speed the development of new drug therapies and bring them to patients in their local communities so they don't have to leave home to get the very best in cancer treatments. To accomplish these goals, the GHI will leverage many new sophisticated electronic technologies as well as DNA sequencing of more than 600 cancer genes. So stay tuned in the months ahead for more information about this fast-moving project. The Space, Cancer, and Personalized Medicine Conference covers what you might think is an eclectic set of topics. But as you listen today and tomorrow, I think you'll find they are very well connected. You'll begin to see how technology and science developed on the space station can radically change life on Earth for the better. You'll hear how cancer and personalized medicine are very much interrelated, and how NASA's efforts to understand and mitigate the effects of microgravity on astronauts through projects like the Gene Lab that Julie Robinson will discuss later today also requires a personalized approach. And you'll hear about some of the currently funded projects by CASIS that are flying 200 miles above us today. We have a broad range of interesting speakers today and over the next 2 days who will discuss these very timely topics. So let me introduce today Dr. Mark Watson, your moderator. Dr. Mark Watson is the Chief Operating Officer for the Gibbs Health Institute. He holds an MD Ph.D. degree from Duke University in pathology and genetics and spent the last decade working for Merck to integrate pharmacogenomics in clinical trials. Please welcome Dr. Mark Watson and enjoy the conference. Please also visit our exhibitors and sponsors for the conference at the breaks. And please put your cell phones on space station mode for the conference. Thank you very much. Dr. Watson.
Hi, good morning. How's everybody doing, despite the fun weather here? Sorry about that, but that's what brings the green trees and grass, obviously. So it's great to have everybody here. You guys are in for a real treat this morning. I think we're setting the record for the most miles traveled for our session. I think everybody came at least 2,000, maybe more miles to get here. So we have folks from Utah, from Washington State, from California, Mountain View. So really excited. I don't think it's a secret, if you've followed any amount of news, that we're in the era of big data. And I've wondered about what that means, but we'll talk about big data maybe in a minute. But basically, you're probably aware that what brought us to this era of big data is we have huge advancements in computing power, in data storage, data handling capabilities, and we're all kind of sitting here at kind of the nexus of this kind of data revolution. And that affects many different fields, but especially healthcare. So we're going to hear a lot about how big data is affecting patient care and especially cancer care. Recently, Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, said that this smartphone that you have in your hand has 10,000 times more computing power than the computers that sent man to the moon, which is just staggering to think about. Last week, I was getting a lot of whining about my son, about the human rights issues of taking away his iPhone for some school problems he was having. And I reminded him that I survived an entire grammar school, high school, and college education without any cell phones at all. But it didn't seem to impress him that much. So, so we're here, and we've arrived in the era of big data and big IT. So today you're going to hear from 3 vibrant and young investigators. I really consider them young guns in this field, and really excited to hear what they have to say. They're at the cutting edge of big genetic data and big cancer data, and we're really fortunate to bring you these people. The first speaker today is Jeff Pollard. Jeff is the medical director of medical affairs at 23andMe. He's responsible for strategic partnerships with healthcare organizations, including providers, population researchers, healthcare IT companies, and regulatory groups. He's got key responsibilities of integrating genomics into the modern healthcare environment, so you're going to hear a lot about that. Jeff graduated from Vanderbilt for medical school and trained as a plastic and head and neck surgeon at Stanford, and he's worked in the private sector founding a couple of companies, and specifically the medical expert director for HealthTap, which is an online mobile apps company, which he's not really going to talk about today. But so we're really excited to have Jeff talk about 23andMe and how they're using big genetic data to bring genetics to consumers. So.
While we're getting the presentation queued up, I just want to say thank you to Tim, to Bruce, Mark, thank you, Charles, and the other sponsors. It's wonderful to be here in South Carolina today at this eclectic conference. I'm glad we can be a part of it. It is still about 5:30 in the morning for me, so bear that in mind as we get started. And I'm facing about 5 computer screens, and hopefully I can lock in on one of them. So I'm Director of Medical Affairs from 23andMe. I'm going to present the topic of empowering people with their own information about their genetics and how that may relate to personalized medicine moving forward. And by way of disclosure, I am an employee of 23andMe, and therefore I have a financial relationship with that company. So 23andMe, a little bit of background about the company because I think it sets the stage for the rest of the presentation. We are the fastest growing, the largest, and most comprehensive direct-to-consumer personal genetics company. We were founded in 2006. We have about 130 employees at this time and many Ph.D.s and a couple of physicians full-time. In 2007, we had a product on the market which was available for about $1,000, which analyzed your genome and returned about 15 different health-related reports back to you. In 2013, thanks to the advances in technology and our process, we were able to offer a product on the market that was $99, scanned your genome, and returned about 250 different reports on conditions and traits. We have a product called the Personal Genome Service, which has been named Invention of the Year by Time Magazine back in 2008, and also that same year we were recognized as a technology pioneer by the World Economic Forum. Our research has generated 4 NIH grants, multiple papers and scientific abstracts, and we have a number of different international collaborations on the research front. Our core mission is really to engage, educate, and empower individuals with their own genetic information. And number 2 is to accelerate the pace of research using human genetics. And number 3, to support the integration of genetics at the point of care in the healthcare system. For those of you that aren't familiar with our service, I'll just walk you through the process. It's quite simple so you can understand what we're actually talking about. If you go online, you can order a kit for $99, and in the mail a couple days later you'll get this little saliva collection tube. You spit in the tube, you drop it back in the mail, and within a few weeks through a secure online environment you're exploring your own DNA, and we send you an email saying welcome to you. So what can an individual learn from their genetic data? Well, it turns out there's a lot of information one can learn, including several different categories. The first most important category would probably be the way that you may respond to certain medications, and we call that pharmacogenomics. And that can be broken down into whether or not you are a responder to certain medications, and also on what, to what degree may you respond to a medication. So are you more sensitive to a medication or less sensitive to a medication? And a third bucket there in the pharmacogenetic arena is, are you predisposed to any side effects to certain medications? It turns out there's a number of medications that we can look at and learn about your responses to them through your genetics. Disease risks is a whole other category. So based on your germline DNA, to what extent are you at risk to develop certain conditions such as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, diabetes, and the like. We also do a full exploration of your inherited condition risk. So for example, do you carry genes that would predispose one to cystic fibrosis or Bloom's or Gaucher? And we also do a variety of interesting traits such as, is your hair likely to be straight or kinky, or do you have blue eyes or brown eyes? And the ever popular, after you eat asparagus, can you smell it in your urine? So we can learn all these wonderful things through analyzing the genome. We also do a full ancestry panel, a composition, which is also quite engaging to consumers. So who learns what? Well, this is just a quick snapshot of the kinds of information that are that's being learned by individuals who take a test such as this. And almost a quarter of the people will find out that they are a carrier for ApoE, which puts them at risk for Alzheimer's disease. About 8% learn that they have factor V Leiden, which puts them at increased risk for venous thromboembolism. About 5.5% learn that they're at risk for macular degeneration, which is an age-related issue related to sight. And 5% will learn that they're carriers for cystic fibrosis. This is just a snapshot. Obviously, there's a lot more data out there for different conditions, but this just gets you oriented. So the second pillar of our foundation, our core mission, is research, as I mentioned. And so it's important for all of you to understand that the kind of research that we're doing is called genome-wide associations. And the premise of a genome-wide association is that you can start out with a hypothesis-free question and take all the data that we have from all the hundreds of thousands of genomes that we have and look for associations with any number of different conditions. And so what that allows us to do is, for example, with this little jar of marbles, is to say, are there any marbles that have the color black? And we can say, yes, there are marbles with the color black. And is there anything else in common with those marbles? And in this case, they all have white lines. Now, in this small jar of marbles, that association wouldn't be very strong. But if you multiply that across an entire population, a much larger population, and that association holds up, you can see how the power of that association becomes much stronger. So that's essentially what a genome-wide association study is doing, looking at a population and saying, okay, we want to look at the condition diabetes. And so out of the hundreds of thousands of genomes that we have, how many people have diabetes? And of that group, is there some consistency with the different alleles that those folks with diabetes carry? So that's an example of a GWAS. We can also flip it and do something called a PheWAS, which is looking at phenotype and trying to, so basically taking an allele and match that up to a phenotype. So does someone with this specific allele, what characteristics do they have in their phenotype? And maybe they all have, migraines or type 2 diabetes and such. So you can do the studies in two different ways to try to answer different questions. So the types of data that we're collecting include things like diagnoses, medication usage, response to medications, family history of disease, health behaviors, a bunch of just demographic information, personality traits, environmental exposures, and all this. This all can be used in the GWAS type of research. We're probably most well known for our Parkinson's research. We have the world's largest cohort of genotype Parkinson's patients at now over 10,000 participants. This was an effort that took a few years to enroll, but after we enrolled 10,000 patients, we were able to, in a matter of a couple of months, verify and validate and validate all of the existing known genetic associations between the genome and Parkinson's disease that had taken about a decade to come up with previously. So we were able to really accelerate, and we also came up with a couple of novel findings as well related to risk for Parkinson's disease. But we were able to replicate what had been done over a matter of, number of years in a matter of a couple of months with a lot less money. So in this fashion, we're really accelerating the pace of research. And so it's not surprising to see that folks are talking about this in such a way as, to say that we were able to do in just a matter of months what would have taken several years and millions of dollars. We also just launched an inflammatory bowel disease study, which is similar to the Parkinson's disease study. It's a partnership with Pfizer, and we're specifically looking at, to what extent are there genetic underpinnings for the ways that IBD patients may respond to certain medications. We have a number, if you just break down our database, there are a number of different cohorts that you can create with massive control groups as well. So you can just see some of the representative numbers related to phenotypes that we have in our database with thousands, or in some cases tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of patients in these groups. And so it's very interesting for researchers to come to us with their questions about the underpinnings of genetics and the questions in the diseases that they're focused on. So the third pillar of our foundation is really built on clinical utility, and we think that there hopefully will be a lot of clinical utility for what we're doing, and we're trying to figure this all out still, but we think there's at least 3 areas in which we can have some immediate clinical utility. The first being gaining early insights about heritable conditions and using that to help guide diagnosis and to help proactively lower the risk of disease-related adverse events. The second is the pharmacogenomic piece, and so using medication, identifying gene medication interactions and thereby recommending appropriate therapeutic choices. The third would be leveraging our engaging health resource platform to educate and empower individuals, specifically trying to motivate those with genetically increased risk for certain conditions to follow up with recommended and appropriate adult preventive services. So we really have this platform that we believe is designed to drive change, and it comes about because of advancements in 3 distinct areas, the first being all the great work that was done with the Human Genome Project, combining that with the ability to really engage consumers. And I'm sorry for the formatting here, but this was done on a Mac, so we had a little Mac PC formatting that didn't come out right. But nonetheless, then also the third leg of that is just using information technology to manage these massive sets of data. And so looking at what the Human Genome Project has done for us, it's really been this explosion of GWAS. And if you look back at 2006, here's a representation of all the points in the genome that were associated with disease conditions that are listed on the right side. And if you can see, it's kind of hard, but there's a few little dots on there. By 2008, you can see that the number of studies published with GWAS results was growing. By 2010, much more. 2012, you can see it's just massive growth in research in this area. And I don't have the 2014 slide, but I imagine it's going to be filled with lots of little polka dots. So then we have this really engaging platform on 23andMe where about 40% of our customers are re-engaging with the website every month. So this gives us a really unique opportunity to ask those people questions and discover more about their phenotype. And so if we've identified an interesting cohort in our database, we can go back to them and ask them survey questions that might help answer some research questions. And then that third leg of this triangle is just managing big data. So we have over 650,000 genotypes that have been analyzed. Each of those has almost 1 million data points. And for phenotypic responses to our survey questions, we have over 750 million data points there. At one point last year, we were getting about 5 million phenotypic data points a week. So it's this massive data collection that, thanks to technology, we're able to manage. So something's clearly happening in this field. And if you look at personal genetics, if you do a PubMed search, which I did last year, about midway through last year, you can see that there's over 11,000 articles with personalized medicine in their title, 7,500 articles with genomics in the title, over 50 articles with personal genomics in the title, and interestingly enough, there were 23 articles that mentioned 23andMe. And there are probably actually more because we were really the biggest and the only company doing this kind of research. Most people refer to us as the direct-to-consumer personal genetics company and don't really mention us by name. So something's clearly happening, and our company was really taking this to the center stage through our growth, primarily our growth last year, and we were able to reduce our price to $99. We did a bunch of advertising. We had our Parkinson's research that was really thriving, and it got a lot of national attention to the point where our CEO was actually featured on the cover of Fast Company magazine, and almost the next day, but at least several days after that, we got a letter from the FDA saying we need to talk. And so right as our company was really starting to take off and we had over 500,000 customers and the growth was really moving along quite nicely, the FDA looked at us and said, you're really a medical device in that you're gathering a sample from somebody, analyzing it in a lab, and then interpreting those results and referencing back to them their risk for certain conditions. And medical devices are under the FDA's jurisdiction. And so we are now currently engaged with the FDA in this regulatory process, and that's going well. But it's allowed for this sort of pause in the action. And so one of the focuses of the talk today is, what's all the fuss? Let's break it down, because I think it's not just the FDA that's asking these questions. It's folks like you and me. It's our consumers. It's those stakeholders in the healthcare world that are asking these questions, such as, well, can consumers really process and handle this information, and what good is it really? So they're asking the questions about emotional distress and or lack of interest in this kind of information. They're asking questions about poor interpretation or misinterpretation of the data. They're asking questions about the inappropriate utilization that might come from getting this kind of information. Questions about privacy and insurance. The question of no one's been able to prove any beneficial change from actually getting this information. What about the fact that doctors aren't trained appropriately to get this information? What about the fact that risk is very vague and maybe not that meaningful to people? The costs may be too high, and other questions that are more esoteric, but like what about testing in children? So there are a lot of good questions being asked, and so what I want to do today is kind of break down what we know, what research has shown about some of these areas, and try to shed some light on what the current state of affairs is on our knowledge in this area. So I'm going to reference during the next few minutes several papers that are published that have come out since 2008, primarily from 3 centers. Harvard's been a leader in this area, looking at the effects of direct-to-consumer testing on consumer behavior, and that's led by Robert Green. The second hub, if you will, has come from Scripps, and that's led by Eric Topol. And then there's a paper that I'll reference as well from Uta Franke, who was actually our senior medical director at the time, but is also a professor of medical genetics at Stanford. And I'm happy to share and give more information about these particular papers if you want to discuss that with me later. But for the sake of moving things along during the talk today, I'm not going to cite specifics about the papers as I go through the data. I'll reference them and then move on. There is one, the top study, the impact of personal genomics, or what we call the PGen study. This is one of Robert Green's studies out of Harvard. It's actually, the data has not been published, although there have been some, this is what I guess is happening in science and research now. There has been some early releases of information that have been published in Nature. So that, as of yet, is still not in a peer-reviewed format that we're typically used to seeing. But I'm going to reference data that he has published there. So let's break it down. So let's look at how people are responding with respect to emotional distress or their level of interest to getting this kind of information. And I'm going to talk about three main studies that were done. The first is called the REVEAL study, and there were three phases to that, but that was looking at first-degree relatives of patients that had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and giving them their ApoE results, so randomly assigning them to either get ApoE results or not, and then measuring symptoms of anxiety, depression, and test-related distress at 6 weeks, 6 months, and then 12 months following the disclosure or non-disclosure. I'm also going to talk about the SCRIPS, what I call the IMPACT study, which looked at over 1,300 subjects that were evaluated at 6 months and a year after genotyping, and they measured test-related distress. And then PGen, which is the other Harvard study, looked at over 1,000 subjects who were surveyed prior to the results and then at 2 and 6 months. And they also measured anxiety. In the REVEAL, the first phase of the REVEAL study, they found no significant differences between the two groups, so the first-degree relatives that got their genotype results and those that did not get their genotype results related to anxiety, depression, or test-related distress. They did a secondary comparison to really try to vet this out. They looked at the non-disclosure group, so the controls, if you will, and then those that just had E4 positivity. And between those two groups, where you'd expect to be the biggest difference in anxiety and distress, they found no significant differences there. Baseline scores for anxiety and depression were strongly associated with post-disclosure scores for these measures. So if you tended to be more anxious going into the test, you tended to be more anxious on the backside of the test. However, again, there was no significant increase in that post-test measurement. 90% of all subjects from each groups reported that they would do the test again, whether they were in the non-disclosure group or the disclosure group. In the second phase of that, they actually shared ApoE results as a risk factor for not only Alzheimer's disease, but also for coronary artery disease. And they showed, interestingly enough, that when you disclose risks for two conditions, the test-related distress actually is lower than if you give the risk for just one condition, which is a very interesting phenomenon. At SCRIPS, at 6 months, there was no measurable impact on test-related distress. Long-term follow-up at 1 year also showed no significant differences from baseline. 99.7% had no clinically significant test-related distress. Understanding and anxiety. So it turns out actually that individuals who reported that they understood their results showed lower test-related distress at long-term follow-up. And that's a really important thing for us to learn, because as a direct-to-consumer company, we have a very, we have this interest in making sure that people do understand their results through labeling and through education. And so it turns out that that actually can help mitigate for anxiety as well. With PGen, they looked at psychological responses, short and long term. They established a baseline prior to receiving the result, and then they looked at anxiety following that, and anxiety was actually reduced at the time of disclosure in 6 months. So people started with a certain level of anxiety before they got the results. After receiving the results, their anxiety was significantly reduced across the board. They then stratified this by percent of conditions with increased risk. So they said, okay, well, sure, if you didn't get any, if you got a report with just one risk factor being elevated, maybe you'd be less anxious than someone who, say, got 3 or 4 or 5 results that showed increased risk. And it turns out that there was no significant change across the board from people who got less than 15% of the reports showing increased risk to those with even greater than 25% of their reports showing increased risk. Anxiety scores were then stratified by baseline anxiety, and higher 2-week anxiety, folks had higher 2-week anxiety if their baseline anxiety was higher to begin with. So some of these things kind of make intuitive sense, but as a group in each segment, it was lower overall. Uta Franke then did a study looking at unexpected BRCA results. And so she measured the immediate reactions of 32 people who had received BRCA mutation results. BRCA is the gene that puts you at incredibly high risk for breast cancer. So a condition where you'd think there'd be a lot of anxiety related to this. And in the 32 people that she interviewed, none of them reported having any extreme anxiety. Moderate anxiety was mentioned in 4 subjects. 9 had some transitory upset. Most were in this neutral category, and 2 actually felt some form of relief. And there was no mention of any long-term emotional disturbance. So what about lack of interest? So another ongoing study at Harvard is called MedSeek. And in MedSeek, they have about 100 patients enrolled so far, and they're asking patients what kind of information they would want to learn from this type of testing. And so if you look at the blue box on the left, with respect to severity of information, 100% of the people enrolled so far said they definitely want to know things that could be life-threatening to them. They also want to know things that could be serious but not life-threatening. And about 90% of the people want to know information related to things that aren't treatable and not even preventable. In the orange box, with respect to the degree of disease risk, over 90% of the subjects so far have mentioned that they want information related to all of these categories, whether it's substantially increased risk, moderately increased risk, slightly increased risk, or decreased risk. The really surprising finding so far in the red box is that over 70% of people want to know their results, even if we have no idea what they mean. So we could literally say, we have a piece of paper here with a bunch of letters and numbers on it, and we have no idea what it means, but it's yours. Do you want it? And over 70% of people say, absolutely, I want that. Give me that piece of paper, and I completely understand that nobody has any idea what it means. But I think it's a real testament to the fact that, A, people want what's theirs. They see this, they really are focused on wanting to gather as much information about themselves as they can, even if today they don't know what the meaning is. If that decoder ring comes out tomorrow, I want to be first in line to figure out the answer. So give me the information, give me the data now, and I'll wait, expectantly, hoping that the decoder ring comes out tomorrow. So it's a real interesting phenomenon that we're seeing here. Also related to lack of interest, the question of lack of interest in PGen, they asked folks what the top reports of interest were across a spectrum of 200 different conditions, and you can see the list of those that came up first. These are obviously serious conditions that people want information on. In the REVEAL study, over 90% said they would do the test again. So there's clearly some interest in getting this information, even if we don't know exactly what the value is today. Most would request to do the test again with the information that they have today. What about poor interpretation or misinterpretation? So in Scripps, the impact study, they looked at perceived understanding, and 75% of participants felt that they did understand their results. Well, you could look at that in 2 ways. You say, well, 75% is not bad for taking information that's heavily steeped in genetics and medicine and presenting it to people who have no background in genetics or medicine. And you could also look at it and say, like, well, it's not 100%, it should be 100%. But I think it's a good starting point. It certainly gives us some room to, refine what we're doing, but also know that we're on a good path. So again, those who reported that they understood their results also, as I mentioned, showed lower anxiety at long-term follow-up. So there's definitely some importance in making sure people understand what they're getting. What about inappropriate utilization? This is a big one. So in the BRCA study that Dr. Franke from Stanford did, again, looking at 32 people with BRCA mutations, and it was controlled with another 30 that received information that they did not have the mutation. Most of the carrier women, so what did they do with this information? So most of the carrier women sought medical attention. Not everybody did, but that's okay. That's a representative section of the population, and not everybody acts on risk. But many of them did seek medical attention. 4 underwent risk-reducing procedures after confirmatory testing was performed. Interestingly enough, the male carriers who were in this group realized that there was a risk for their female relatives. And so they said, well, gosh, I may not be at much greater risk for breast cancer, but my sister, who could have inherited the same genes, might be. So they recognized that and contacted, in many cases, their first-degree relatives to have them tested. That led to cascade testing of about 30 relatives and identification of 13 more carriers. So people are taking this information, realizing what the impact it may have on them, and then also looking at their relatives and understanding the risk that it may have for their relatives. The other side of this is, well, what happens if you realize that you're at low genetic risk? Do you just throw caution to the wind and not follow up with recommended screening? And there was no report of any inappropriate action, such as foregoing screening in this fashion from this group. In REVEAL, the second phase of REVEAL, again, looking at first-degree relatives of patients with known Alzheimer's disease, they did a survey at 6 weeks and asked about things like diet and exercise, medications and supplements, and in this case, supplements means non-food herbal supplements, vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. And 16% of all participants reported a change in dietary supplement use after learning their Alzheimer's disease risk. Not a lot, but there's evidence that some people are doing something. And even if, and we don't know necessarily what value there is in changing their supplements or vitamins, but they're looking to do something. They're motivated to do something. Patients with at least one copy of E4 had 4.75 times the odds of reporting a change in dietary supplement use than those with no E4 variant. Again, they're just looking for things that they can do to try to mitigate their risk. But it's also evidence that people are understanding that genes just control part of this, right? That it's a mix of genes and environment, and to the extent that you can try to change your environment. Sadly, no changes were noted for diet, exercise, or medication. We're still looking for the magic cure for diet and exercise. This one's not it, apparently. E4 participants were significantly more likely than E-negative participants and controls to endorse any Alzheimer's disease-specific health behavior change. And of the 3 behaviors surveyed, E4 positive participants most commonly endorsed changing their medications or vitamins for the purpose of preventing Alzheimer's disease. And when they looked at this after going through some of the longer term data, it turned out that actually vitamin E was the most common change in this area. So people are feeling that vitamin E has some effect on their risk for Alzheimer's disease. In the PGen study, they looked at healthcare utilization within 6 months after getting your results, and about a third, 28%, reported that they took this information to their primary care doctor, which is interesting in a lot of ways. We can talk about that. About 3% discussed it with a genetic specialist. 11% made an appointment with a medical professional. 10% planned to make an appointment with a medical professional, and about 10% also followed up with exams, tests, or procedures related to the information they received from their genetic analysis. Dietary and exercise changes were reported to be, 30% reported dietary and exercise changes at 6 months post-result. It's a little bit more than in REVEAL. Prescription medication changes, this is an area of big interest, right? Because what we want to ensure is that people don't try to change their prescription medication doses or regimens on their own without guidance from a healthcare professional. And this is, I think, pretty promising data that's come from PGen so far, which is that 94% of people reported no change. 5% reported a change with, after getting a medical consultation related to that, which I think is good, because that means something was there that shouldn't have been there, and this information helped them rectify that through their healthcare provider. And then 1% actually made a change to their medication regimen without medical consultation, and this is obviously the area that we need to try to get to 0. But again, given where we are so far, it's not a bad starting place. There's a visual representation of this data that was published in Nature just a couple of months ago, and it basically, I can let you guys look at this without going through it in too much detail, but again, the key feature there was what happened with prescription medications. And in this case, the percentage in the diagram says 2%, but that's because you're just looking at half of the sample size, so it was 1% overall, just to clarify that. In Scripps, at 1 year, in the Scripps study at 1 year, 13 health screening behaviors were assessed. They looked at actual completion of those screening behaviors and intention to complete those screening behaviors with greater frequency. They also looked at fat intake, exercise, and the degree to which results were shared with the primary care physician. 42% reported at least one or more screening tests that they intended to complete with greater frequency post-genetic testing. So that could be like getting your cholesterol checked, things like that. 14% reported discussing their results with a genetic counselor. Speaking with a genetics counselor was associated with actual screening test completion. There's something about going and talking about it with somebody led to actually, following through with screening at a higher rate. About 40% reported sharing results with their own healthcare provider. And speaking with a physician was associated with higher exercise, actual screening test completion, and intention to increase frequency of screening. I think this is wonderful because this is really, getting results is one thing at home and sitting there and trying to figure out what you're going to do with it. But people are actually taking these results, going to their physician, coming up with a plan, and then following through. And there's a greater likelihood that you'll actually follow through with those changes once you've gone through that process of consulting with a healthcare provider. So it's just an interesting way to start thinking about how this whole ecosystem is coming together to personalize medicine for each individual. Again, at Scripps, they looked at who was getting the screening and actual screening test completions between sharers and non-sharers of data was statistically significant at all age groups except for those that are less than 30. And you could say that's probably okay because folks who are less than 30 don't really fall much into the screening, standard screening groups anyway. So we don't need to be, falsely elevating screening in that group. And also the older, the folks over 60 probably are integrated enough into the healthcare system that they're getting appropriate screenings anyway. But this group of 30 to 60 is a group that we really need to try to impact with respect to recommended screenings. And so there was some impact there. For 5 of the screening test condition pairs, individuals who both shared and received a high genomic risk estimate were more likely to screen, and you can see the areas that were affected there. That ophthalmologic exams, EKGs, colonoscopy, cholesterol, and blood tests for hemochromatosis were the top 5. So what about consumer perceived utility? So over 90% saw some utility. 35 thought it was somewhat useful, and over 60% thought the information was very useful for them. With utility and screening, perceiving the genetic test results to be useful was obviously associated with both total number of screening tests completed and intention to screen. And interestingly enough, when you assigned in the reveal, the third phase of the reveal trial, when you assigned ApoE results to greater risk for Alzheimer's disease and heart disease, that did influence downstream exercise versus just reporting ApoE in the context of Alzheimer's disease alone. So pairing that with coronary artery disease risk got people to exercise. Now what about insurance? This is another big question. So there was a paper that came out looking at genetic testing for Alzheimer's and long-term care insurance, and just by way of background, about 75% of people developing Alzheimer's disease eventually go to a nursing home. And so they asked the question, is ApoE a genetic marker for those at risk of future long-term care use? And they also asked, does ApoE genotype independently predict actual nursing home placements? And so they looked at over 270 people with a mean age of 58 and saw that having at least one E4 allele increased the likelihood of moving to a nursing home, controlling for other factors, among elderly people living in a community setting. And that E4 positive individuals were about 50 times more likely than those without to enter a nursing home during a 10-year follow-up period. Not too surprising. But then they asked the question, were these subjects who received E4 positive results more likely to purchase long-term care insurance after finding out their results? And they were 2.3 times more likely than those without to increase long-term care insurance holdings or reporting planning to do so. So again, it's just more evidence that people are taking action based on this information. There's a lot of things we can talk about related to insurance and privacy. I don't have this in this talk, but it's always worth mentioning that Americans are protected under federal legislation, an act called GINA, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which protects Americans from any discrimination for employment or with health insurance related to their genetic predispositions. So it's just good to mention that. What about willingness to pay? This is so expensive, and who would be willing to pay for this kind of information? So in the reveal trial, they asked folks, what their threshold was for cost. And if you look at the blue box on the left, you'll see that almost 50% were willing to pay hundreds of dollars for, and keep in mind this was just for the ApoE result. So just for one result, they're willing to pay up to $500, in some cases even $1,000 or more. The majority were willing to pay hundreds of dollars for this information. 70, in the orange box now, 71% would request it if insurance covered it. 60% would pay for it even if it was self-pay. Again, this is just for the one result. This is just for ApoE. 29% would not want the testing done if it were done in the doctor's office and covered by insurance. So this is the other side, which is people saying, about 30% of people said, I don't want my doctor or my insurance company to be involved. I just want to own the information myself and decide what I want to do with it. So we're getting close to the end of this part of the presentation, and I just want to wrap it up by saying that there is another study at Harvard called BabySeq, which is looking at the viability and the appeal for testing children in the newborn setting for their genetic risks. And this is an ongoing study, but they have over 400 participants so far, and what they did was they asked parents at the time of admission, would you be interested in genome screening for your newborn? And 80% showed interest during that first admission. 35 were somewhat interested, 30% very interested, and 15% were extremely interested. But then they said, well, you know, when you just had a baby and you're in the hospital, you're gonna say yes to anything, right? It's like, can I get you some ice chips? Yes, you know. Can I get you a foot rub? Yes. Can I get you genetic testing your baby? Sure, you just do it. So then they went back and said, well, let's control for that. Let's go back at 3 months when they're out of this setting, life's kind of settled down again, and ask them the same question. And at 3 months post-birth, 90% of parents were equally interested as they were in the hospital. And then when they said, well, here's the kind of information you can get, and they actually gave them a mock report and had them look at it, then 95% were interested in it 3 months post-admission. So there seems to be a lot of interest in moms and dads, and that's obviously a whole another ball of wax to try to figure out. But things could be moving in that direction too. So quickly, looking at the takeaways from all that information, there doesn't appear to be, in several studies that were fairly well designed, there doesn't appear to be any significant anxiety or test-related distress. And we certainly haven't heard. We've analyzed nearly 700,000 genomes at this point, and we don't know of any incidences of any detrimental impacts on psychological well-being from this type of information. And it turns out that interestingly, when you report on multiple findings, that could actually lower stress in certain circumstances. And understanding your results better helps to lower stress as well. Second bullet point, patients seem to want it all. They want to know the high-risk stuff, the life-threatening stuff, even if there's no treatment. There does seem to be some reluctance to have tests covered by insurance. Many are happy to pay hundreds of dollars even for just one test. 75% claim to understand their results. There's some work to be done there. And almost nobody's taking the wrong action. Again, I think the most critical thing here is that issue of changing a medication, something that's within your reach, and doing that without guidance from a healthcare provider. And at this point, it seems like that's about 1% of people. There doesn't seem to be a solution for weight loss, but we can drive some change, and that's just a testament to the awareness that I think we're creating when you give people this information, and there's this teachable moment where somebody's really heavily engaged in something that's about them, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there to help guide change. 30% are taking results to their primary care physician, and that actually seemed to drive behavior change, and I think that's something that we need to drill down on and really discover how we can best utilize that relationship between a patient and a provider to really help personalize care and get people motivated to make changes that will help prevent conditions downstream. And it turns out that moms and dads seem to be ready. I don't know if we are, but that's certainly going to come roaring down the pipe pretty soon. So although we did have this pause, we seem to be, as a company, we're also somewhat back on track because of several things. One is we do have ongoing pharmaceutical partnerships where we're trying to accelerate new drug development. We're partnering with healthcare systems to build evidence for population health management and personalized medicine. We're using information technology to try to integrate genomic data at the point of care. And we have a big education initiative as well where we're supporting what I call our K through MD spectrum of learners to really help them prepare for this new genomic era. We also have international opportunities. I just want to point out that this slide is not representative of countries that we are or will be in necessarily, but these are just English-speaking countries. But we do hope to have an international health product available, hopefully this year, to be back to relaunch and be back on the market internationally. So I will conclude there. I think hopefully a little bit ahead of schedule. And I know we have a panel coming up, so I don't know if we'll hold questions for that time. Okay, great. So that was a lot of information, but thank you for bearing with me. Glad I got through it, and I'm happy to say that it's now 6 o'clock my time, so.